All right, well, welcome back to our Kingdom Outpost study. This is the second lesson in the book of Esther, and we actually get to dive into the book of Esther, chapter 1, in this lesson. And we're going to talk all about kings. And in this lesson, we're going to meet King Artaxerxes, and we're going to be able to compare him to King Jesus. And we just want to start this discussion with talking about bad kings. King Artaxerxes is going to be an example of a pretty bad king, and he's going to get worse and worse throughout the book, but really right off the bat, he doesn't come off very glowing. He comes off as a pretty bad king. So just start the discussion with your group talking about bad kings that we see throughout scripture and just brainstorm a little bit about some of those bad kings. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a king. Any kind of human ruler will do. I mean, you can think about, of course, King Saul, who's probably the first example of a bad king in Israel. You can think about some of the kings of Israel that led them into idolatry. You can think about Pilate, who was the human ruler during the time of Jesus, and he certainly is not a picture of strength and kindness. You could think about even some of the good kings like King David, who had a pretty famous fall. And anytime you see a ruler that is a human through scripture, they just don't typically come off very well. They, even in the book of Judges, when there's no like one king, the people are doing what's right in their own eyes. And whenever people are allowed to rule themselves, things just seem to go astray and seem to go poorly, and they don't show very well throughout scripture, all these human kings and rulers. So just think with your group a little bit about why that might be, why there are so many examples of bad kings and bad rulers in scripture. And as we walk through this, Artaxerxes is going to be a great example of a really bad king. And as we put him beside Jesus, we really see the difference between what a bad king looks like and what our ultimate King Jesus looks like. And it's really going to make us long for that good king. And so right off the bat, when we open the book of Esther, we're introduced Artaxerxes as this really prideful king. It opens with this great scene of human pride, this great party that's going on. And it really kind of makes it worse when you understand that Artaxerxes didn't really have a reason to be prideful. Almost everything that he had, if not everything that he had inherited it. Other kings had worked for it, other kings had conquered for it, and now he had inherited this great kingdom, and he's taking great pride in something that he really didn't even work for. And this party, at first glance, you may not see this, but if you think about the people during that time, that most of them were farmers and laborers and barely had enough to get by, and they are throwing this party that lasted for 180 days. That's half a year. Imagine if you're one of these farmers or day laborers and your king is throwing this great party for 6 straight months and you barely have enough to get by. It just shows this tone deafness to the suffering of the people around him and their everyday plight. And so this prideful king is the first thing we see in Artaxerxes. The next thing we see, which kind of doesn't fit well with that prideful image, but is a very limited king. And in this, the next verses, in verses 10 through 22, we're going to meet Queen Vashti. And so you can imagine that Artaxerxes, the pinnacle of his kingdom and all these provinces that he rules and all of this money that he has, the pinnacle of that is, of course, his queen. And he calls her in to this party, and she refuses to come. And the Jewish commentators who would look at the book of Esther would always kind of venerate Vashti as this principled hero, that her refusal to come was not just some kind of rebellion against the king, but it was because of her integrity. And we don't know all the details, but it sure seems like this was a drunken request from a king for his queen to come in, and it just kind of reeks of inappropriateness, and that Vashti is actually doing a righteous thing by refusing to come in. But the king is kind of shown pretty poorly in front of all of his friends, that the king who commands 127 provinces and has this great huge feast is ruined by one woman, and that's his wife, the queen. And so he gets really, really angry at Vashti, but then he's shown even more and more limited, because as angry as he is, he takes no action. Ironically, instead of doing something with that anger, he turns to the council and he asks the council what he's supposed to do. So he can't even make a decision about how he should handle this situation where he is shown up and embarrassed. He turns to the council and looks for advice. And lest we think there's any kind of righteousness or wisdom in this, the council pretty much says, well, Vashti's actions are going to be seen as an excuse for every woman to disobey her husband. And so their advice is not exactly righteous either. So just as you walk through this with your group, we want to see Artaxerxes for what he really is. He is this king who has inherited a kingdom, who shows it off with great pride, but he really can't make decisions. He really is a poor husband at the very least, and really a poor king. And so all of that makes us long for a good king. And this is where our memory verse comes in. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will never cast out. And of course, that's Jesus talking. And when you compare that to what Artaxerxes does with Vashti, Artaxerxes casts Vashti out. And Jesus said that he would never cast us out. And of course, we see in Jesus a king who cares for his people's suffering and would go to any length to redeem his people and redeem his children. And that's the exact opposite of what we see in Artaxerxes. And so all of this put together, putting Artaxerxes and his pride and his limits and all of his shortfalls and failures, and we put it beside King Jesus, and it just shows how wonderful a king we have, that he would not cast out his people, he would not cast out his bride, and that just makes us long for the good king.